How do you know if a painting is real? Most of the time, nobody actually knows for certain. They just agree to believe the person telling them it is. This world will teach you exactly how much that agreement is worth across 9 levels and exactly what it costs the day it turns out to be wrong. Level 1. The flea market flipper. You're 19, broke, and you've developed a strange, specific eye for spotting a decent painting buried in a box of junk at an estate sale. You buy a small, unsigned landscape for $30 because something about the brushwork looks better than the price tag suggests. Clean it up, photograph it properly, and sell it online 3 weeks later for $400. It's the first time in your life that looking closely at something has been worth actual money. You're not an art dealer yet. You're a kid with a good eye and a folding table at weekend markets, buying other people's discarded taste for almost nothing and reselling it to people who know slightly more than the seller did. Most weekends teach you nothing. You drive 2 hours to an estate sale on a tip from a friend and come home with nothing worth the gas money. Or worse, with something you were sure about that turns out once you research it properly to be a mass-produced print worth exactly what you paid for the frame. You keep a small notebook of every mistake, which embarrasses you and which you keep anyway, because the mistakes teach you faster than the wins do. There's another regular at the same markets, older than you by 20 years, who's been doing this longer and treats you as competition rather than company from the first weekend he notices you outbidding him on a box lot. You learn to read the same tells in him that you're learning to read in the paintings. Which sales he's driving to tells you which ones he thinks are worth the trip, and you start beating him there. He never warms up to you. You learn the trade from his irritation almost as much as from your own research. Your parents think this is a phase, the way parents do about anything that doesn't look like a real job yet. You make maybe $12,000 in your first full year of this, on top of a part-time job, and you spend more of it than you should on gas driving to estate sales 3 counties away because you can't shake the feeling that the next box might have something real in it. Once, it does. A small drawing, unsigned, that a specialist you cold email confirms is a genuine, minor study by an artist with real museum credits. You sell it for $6,000. It's the first time the math of this hobby has ever made sense to anyone but you. Level 2. The gallery assistant. A small gallery owner named Odette hires you off the strength of a single conversation, after you correctly identify from across the room that a piece she's about to hang is a later reprint and not the original edition she thinks it is. She doesn't get angry. She gets curious. The job pays barely enough to live on. $32,000 a year, answering phones, wrapping paintings, standing quietly in the corner of openings while people with real money discuss things you're not yet allowed to have an opinion about out loud. Odette teaches you the actual trade in fragments, between tasks, the way real expertise usually gets passed down, not as a lecture, but as a correction, delivered flatly, the moment you get something wrong. You misquote a piece's provenance to a curious visitor during your second week, confidently and completely incorrectly, and Odette corrects you in front of the visitor without softening it at all. You're mortified for exactly as long as it takes her to explain afterward that the visitor will forget the mistake by tomorrow and you won't, and that's the entire point of her not protecting you from it. She has you handle a piece worth more than your annual salary within your first month, hands trembling, and tells you afterward that the trembling is correct. Anyone who stops being nervous around real value has stopped paying attention. Late one night, closing up after a show, she tells you the only piece of her own story she ever really volunteers, that she started exactly where you did, at a folding table, and that the gallery took her 11 years to open because nobody would extend a young woman with a good eye and no money the same credit they'd extend a man with half her instincts. She doesn't say it looking for sympathy. She says it like a fact you need on file. A collector who's known Odette for 20 years asks you, one evening, why she never expanded the gallery into something bigger, given how good her eye clearly is. And you realize halfway through your answer that you don't actually know, that you've never once asked her yourself, and that the question suddenly feels too personal to bring to her the next morning the way you'd bring anything else. You never do ask. Some things about a mentor, you learn, you're better off not knowing until they choose to tell you. You spend 2 years in that gallery learning to read a room full of collectors the way you once read a box of junk at an estate sale. Who's serious? Who's performing seriousness? Who's about to buy and doesn't know it yet themselves? Level 3, the emerging artist dealer. You open your own gallery, small, in a neighborhood that's cheap because it isn't fashionable yet, representing artists nobody outside a few hundred people has heard of. You take 50% of every sale, which sounds enormous until you do the math on how few sales there actually are in your first 2 years. Pieces selling for $2,000 to $15,000 sporadically to a small circle of early collectors betting on artists they believe in before anyone else does. You lose money for the first 18 months. There's a specific night, 3 months after opening, where you sit in the gallery after a poorly attended show closes, doing the math on rent due in 9 days against a bank account that doesn't cover it, and you call Odette not for advice, but just to hear someone who's survived this tell you it's survivable. She doesn't reassure you. She asks what you're going to sell in the next 9 days, which turns out to be the more useful question. A collector who's bought from you twice before comes in for the third time and spends 40 minutes negotiating a 15% discount on a $4,000 piece with the intensity most people reserve for buying a house. You hold your price. He buys it anyway, at full price, on his way out the door. And you understand, watching him do it, that the negotiation was never really about the money. It was about being taken seriously as someone whose opinion on the work mattered enough to argue with. You keep going because you can feel, in a handful of the artists you represent, the same thing Odette must have felt looking at you. The sense of catching something early, before the rest of the world agrees it's worth catching. One of your artists gets picked up by a larger gallery in another city, a genuine loss for your business and a genuine point of pride you can't quite separate from each other. You throw her a small party the night the news breaks anyway, and mean every part of your toast. You spend the night before every opening the same way, no matter how many you've done. Rehanging pieces at midnight because the light looks wrong, rewriting wall text you've already rewritten twice, standing alone in the empty gallery trying to see the show the way a stranger will see it in 12 hours. Nobody teaches you this part. You build the ritual yourself out of the 2 or 3 openings that went badly early on. And it never entirely goes away, even years later, even when the openings start going well more often than not. Level 4, the secondary market dealer. You shift into buying and reselling work by artists who are already established, dead or alive, but with real market histories, real auction records, real prices you can point to instead of arguing for. The pieces run $50,000 to $300,000 now, and the job changes shape entirely. Half of it is taste and the other half, increasingly, is provenance, proving where a piece has actually been for the last 50 years, who owned it, whether the paper trail is real or convenient. You buy a piece from an estate sale that turns out to have a 6-year gap in its ownership history nobody can explain. It's probably nothing. Gaps like that usually are. A family member who never filed paperwork, a private sale between friends that left no record, decades before anyone thought provenance would matter this much. You spend 3 weeks and a meaningful chunk of your margin on the deal tracking down enough documentation to close the gap before you're willing to resell it. Old auction catalogs, a retired appraiser's handwritten notes, a phone call to a family member who barely remembers the piece hanging in a hallway 60 years ago. You drive 4 hours to meet the retired appraiser in person rather than settle for a phone call, because his notes reference a second piece from the same original collection that might still exist somewhere. And a lead like that is worth a day of your time, even if it goes nowhere. It goes nowhere. The trip still isn't wasted. He remembers enough about the family's collecting habits to close the last gap in your documentation, over coffee, almost as an afterthought. You learn doing it that this kind of caution is the actual product you're selling now, more than the painting itself. A buyer at this level isn't just paying for the image on the canvas. They're paying you to have already done the worrying so they don't have to. Level 5, the private advisor. Real collectors find you now, not galleries, not other dealers, but individuals with enough money that discretion matters more to them than price. You work directly for a handful of private clients, sourcing pieces quietly, sometimes buying something specifically so it never has to appear at public auction where anyone could see what they're acquiring. Deals run $500,000 to $5 million, and your commission, 2 to 10% depending on the relationship, turns into real money for the first time in your career. One client, a man who's never once told you what he actually does for a living, asks you to acquire a significant piece without his name appearing anywhere in the paperwork. You structure the purchase through an intermediary, entirely legally, and hand-deliver the piece to a storage facility you're not permitted to know the location of in advance. It's the first time you understand that some clients aren't paying for art. They're paying for the version of themselves that owns art nobody else knows about. A different client, an older woman who inherited her collecting habit along with her family's fortune, calls you every time she's simply lonely rather than actually buying. And you learn to tell the difference between those calls within the first 30 seconds, without ever making her feel like the distinction is obvious to you. You spend more unbillable hours with her than with any other client on your books, and you don't mind it. And you're not entirely sure that not minding it is good business. A third client, younger than you, inherited money he didn't grow up expecting and buys art the way some people buy lottery tickets, fast, emotionally, hoping a piece will make him feel like the kind of person who was always going to end up this wealthy. You could sell him almost anything at almost any price and he'd say yes. You don't. You talk him out of 2 purchases in his first year as a client, gently, for reasons that have nothing to do with your commission, and he stays with you for a decade afterward specifically because of the 2 times you told him not to buy. Odette, semi-retired now, tells you over a dinner she insists on paying for that this is the level where the job stops being about art and starts being about trust, that a client isn't paying you for your eye anymore, not really. They're paying you to be the one person in a deal who has no reason to lie to them. You understand, hearing her say it, that you've been quietly building exactly that reputation for a decade without naming it. Level 6, the gray market dealer. Someone offers you a piece here that changes the entire shape of your career, one way or another. It's beautiful, correctly attributed to a genuinely significant artist, priced well below what it should be worth, and the provenance has a hole in it large enough that you know immediately exactly what that hole probably means. It could be stolen. It could be looted decades ago from a family who never got it back. It could simply be a seller who's misplaced some paperwork. You don't actually know which, and the seller, when you push gently on the gap, gets vague in a way that answers the question without either of you saying anything incriminating out loud. You ask him directly once where the piece actually came from. He tells you a story that's technically an answer and actually explains nothing, delivered with the specific fluency of someone who's told it before and had it accepted before. You recognize the fluency. It's the same tone Odette warned you years ago to listen for. Not nervousness, but rehearsal. You turn it down. It costs you a 6-figure commission you'd already half spent in your head, and you spend a week afterward telling yourself you made the right call while a smaller, quieter part of you keeps running the math on what you gave up. You watch, 18 months later, a different dealer sell an almost identical piece with an almost identical gap in its history and get investigated for it publicly. His name in an article you read 3 times before you can stop thinking about how close you came to being him. He loses his license within the year. You keep the article bookmarked, and you're not entirely sure why. The danger at this level isn't that you'll get caught doing something wrong, it's that the version of wrong you're most likely to commit is the one that looks, in the moment, exactly like an unusually good deal, offered by someone who seems entirely reasonable, at a price that only makes sense if you don't ask the one question that matters. You think about the six figures more than you'd like to admit, for longer than you'd like to admit, in the weeks after you turn it down. You run the numbers on what that commission would have meant, the debt it would have cleared, the cushion it would have bought you against the next slow quarter, and you hate, a little, how easy the math is to do from memory even a year later. That's the actual lesson of this level, the one nobody says out loud. Turning down the wrong deal doesn't feel like integrity in the moment. It just feels like a number you didn't get to have. Level 7, the auction house specialist. A major auction house recruits you to handle estate sales for families most people will never know by name. Old money, industrial fortunes, collections built over 3 generations that need to be valued, authenticated, and sold with a level of discretion the family is paying handsomely for. The pieces you're handling now run $5 to $50 million, and a single misattribution, caught by a rival specialist or a skeptical journalist, could end your career inside a single news cycle. You authenticate a piece for a sale that a junior colleague privately flags as questionable, based on brushwork that doesn't quite match the artist's known technique in that period. She's nervous bringing it to you, junior enough that questioning a piece already moving toward a major sale feels like a career risk on its own. You take the concern seriously anyway, the way Odette once took yours seriously from across a gallery floor, and you bring in 2 outside experts rather than dismiss it. The 2 experts disagree with each other before they agree with you, one of them arguing for 40 minutes about a pigment analysis the other considers inconclusive, and you sit through the entire argument taking notes, rather than pushing either of them toward the answer you'd prefer. Both eventually confirm your read. The piece sells for $11 million to a telephone bidder who never once appears in the room, represented by a lawyer you've never met before that afternoon. The entire transaction conducted at a level of remove that would have seemed absurd to you back at the folding table, where every sale ended with you shaking a stranger's hand. 8 months later, new scientific dating technology raises fresh questions about a portion of the same artist's catalog, and you spend a genuinely sleepless month waiting to find out whether the piece you sold is part of the problem, running the junior colleague's original doubt over and over in your head at 3 in the morning. It isn't, this time. The piece clears. You promote her the following quarter, and you understand, waiting through those weeks, that this time is doing more work in that sentence than you'd like it to. Level 8, the power broker. You control access now, not just to paintings, but to the people who own the best ones, and the museums that want to borrow or acquire them. You broker deals worth $50 to $300 million, and your real product at this level is a phone that important people are willing to answer. You place pieces in museums quietly, in exchange for future access to a family's collection. You keep other pieces out of public view entirely, for clients who'd rather own something than be known for owning it. A museum curator you've worked with for a decade calls you, off the record, about a piece you placed in a major private collection 3 years ago. New research suggests a significant attribution problem, one that could unravel a deal worth tens of millions if it goes public before it's quietly resolved. The 2 of you spend 6 weeks managing a process that never makes the news. Additional testing, quiet conversations with the collector, a resolution that satisfies everyone involved without a single public statement being issued. The collector, to his credit, cares less about the money than about being made to look foolish, and you spend more of those 6 weeks managing his pride than managing the actual attribution question. You finish it uncertain whether you handled it with integrity or simply with skill, and increasingly aware that at this level, those 2 things don't always look different from the outside, even to you. The collector sends you a case of wine afterward with a note thanking you for your discretion, and you keep the note longer than you keep the wine, rereading it more than once, trying to decide whether it's a compliment about your character or a receipt for a service rendered. You never fully decide. You stop expecting to. Level 9, the legend. There are a small number of names in this world that function as authentication in themselves. Dealers whose involvement in a sale is treated by museums and billionaires alike as proof enough that a piece is exactly what it claims to be. You are, after 4 decades, one of them. Your word moves tens of millions of dollars without a second opinion being sought, which is either the greatest compliment this world can offer or the single most dangerous kind of trust a person can be given. And most days, you're not sure which. Younger dealers at other houses have started describing a piece as having been through you, the same shorthand collectors once used for the specialists you learned from. And the first time you overhear it applied to your own name, in a room where nobody realizes you're standing close enough to hear it, you don't feel proud. You feel the exact weight of it land, all at once, the way you imagine Odette must have felt it decades before you ever walked into her gallery. Odette died 3 years ago, in her 90s, having sold her small gallery decades earlier and spent her retirement visiting museum wings full of pieces she'd handled as a young woman for a few $100s each. You inherited a small painting from her estate, not valuable, not even attributed to anyone known, the kind of piece that taught you, at 19, to look closely at things nobody else had bothered to. It hangs in your office instead of in storage, worth nothing to anyone who doesn't know what it actually is, and everything to you. You still visit, a few times a year, a museum wing built partly out of pieces you personally placed there over the decades, and you still feel, every time, the specific, quiet pride of watching strangers stop in front of something because of a phone call you made 20 years earlier that nobody in the room will ever know about. A young dealer, hired the way you once were, off the strength of one sharp observation across a crowded room, asks you one afternoon how you actually know, after all this time, whether something's real. You start to give her the technical answer, the science, the provenance research, the expert panels, and stop yourself halfway through because it isn't the honest one. The honest one is that you don't always know. You think, telling her this, about the piece you turned away decades ago, and about the specialist whose career it ended when he said yes to something similar. You think about the $11 million sale that almost wasn't what everyone agreed it was. The question this world never quite lets you answer is the one that matters most. Whether the trust everyone extends you was ever really earned by certainty, or whether you simply got good enough, early enough, that nobody with the power to check ever needed to. You still keep a notebook, the same habit from the folding table at 19, though what goes in it has changed almost completely. Not mistakes about mass-produced prints anymore, but the small, specific doubts that never quite made it into any official report. A brushstroke you weren't 100% certain about. A provenance letter that read half a degree too fluent. Most of the names in that notebook never became anything. A few of them, you suspect, quietly did, and you'll likely never know which. The most expensive lie in this world is the one everyone agrees to keep believing. You spent a lifetime learning exactly how that agreement gets made, and exactly who pays when it breaks. If worlds like this pull you in, there's another one waiting next week. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.